Beautiful pictures come to mind when one thinks of New Mexico and its capital, Santa Fe. A distinctive cultural and physical environment is created by breathtaking sunsets, endless views, an abundance of art galleries. The amazing cuisine enhanced by the local green chile, an ancient Native American culture that is still very much alive, and a Spanish heritage tradition that dates back to within 50 years of Columbus's arrival. The city different, the land of enchantment, is a popular tourist destination, but is it also a spy capital? Spy capital, really. Some of the most well-known and intense spying in history took place in Santa Fe and its larger counterpart in New Mexico, Albuquerque, between the late 1930s and 1946. Only the foreign operatives involved knew about it for years. Although the focus of this piece is World War II, New Mexico has seen other significant espionage occurrences since then. For instance, in 1985, Edward Lee Howard, a former CIA agent and possibly the biggest defector in American history, made a daring escape from Santa Fe to the Soviet Union. In the heart of the American Southwest, what happens? The land of enchantment. What attracted Soviet spies there? In his highly recommended book, A Spy's Guide to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, author E.B. Held, a former CIA agent, asserts that Santa Fe is a sacred city for Russian operatives, and that the famous Cathedral Basilica of Francis of Assisi, with its statue of Bishop Lamy made famous by Willa Cather, is a common location for Russian agents to have their photos taken. We must travel back in time to witness an incredible series of events that resulted in one of the most notable assassinations in history, and one of the most spectacular intelligence coups ever carried out, both connected to Santa Fe, in order to accurately evaluate New Mexico's pivotal role in espionage. Winston Churchill famously remarked, "I cannot predict to you what Russia will do." When we apply this to Soviet intelligence gathering, we are just at the start of a trip that is exacerbated by deceit, misdirection, and buried truth. A fascinating area for historians to go into. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Although it is concealed, the truth exists, and only reliable sources should be trusted. However, whom should I trust? The rub is there. American-Soviet intelligence. We must first comprehend the Soviet intelligence presence in the United States in the late 1930s in order to put these events into context. At the time, there were more than 20 Soviet spy agents working in the United States, represented by the GRU, Chief Intelligence Directorate, or Military Intelligence, and the NKGB, People's Commissariat for State Security, or Political and Internal Security Bureau, including the Gulag, or Political Prison Camp System. After going through several name changes, including OGPU, GPU, NKVD, NKGB, and finally the well-known KGB, the former KGB, originally known as the Cheka, finally became the SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, and FSB, Internal State Security Service. Since NKGB was the most widely used name prior to the war, we will use that title regardless of whether it was accurate in a given year. The acronym effectively blends the historical NKVD with our contemporary meaning. Although it isn't always used, the most recognizable designation for Soviet and contemporary Russian military intelligence is still GRU. The first and second residents. To support the cause of the communist global revolution, these two intelligence services created several distinctive spycraft advances. The idea of the two residencies was the first of these developments. In short, the first resident was a representative of the Soviet embassy in that nation. He operated his own intelligence-gathering outfit and reported to the Moscow center instead of the ambassador. Despite being just marginally visible in the light of day, these operatives were highly significant members of the GRU and later the NKGB, and they were held to high standards. They were to have no contact with the first resident, but would communicate through a member of his team, usually a secretary. The second resident would be someone who was in the country illegally with a false legend or life story, and would typically be involved in some kind of business endeavor as a front. After several issues and agent exposures, this was changed to no contact between the two in the late 1930s. In order to collect necessary intelligence, the second resident would utilize his commercial cover to infiltrate government and industry, often sacrificing his Communist Party membership in the process. This acted as a sort of loyalty test, in addition to removing them from any affiliation with the party. Over time, this two-pronged intelligence offensive would prove to be quite effective. The employment of Mrashkovsky Enterprises, named for its founder, SV, was the second innovation to support the twin residencies and is perhaps one of the most inventive espionage innovations. Mrashkovsky. These lawful companies, which were founded in the early 1920s but grew following the Comintern's failures, were established all over the world to offer agent cover, training, channels for infiltration into the government and business, and a source of clean money. This worked so well that a handful of agents became crucial assets during World War II, and many others were never discovered. The GRU versus the NKGB. Both Walter Krivitsky, the first GRU defector, and Viktor Suvorov, a fictitious name for Vladimir Razun, a post-World War II GRU defector from whom the West has learned much of the GRU operating technique, claimed that the GRU was the most successful intelligence agency in the world by the 1930s. Stalin encouraged their internal conflict, and the boundaries of authority between the two agencies were never clearly defined. In the 1930s and 1940s, both agencies underwent significant purging, and the GRU leadership was frequently executed. Purges also occurred in the NKGB, but from 1938, under the leadership of Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's fellow Georgian henchman and top executioner, the organization's leadership remained remarkably steady. Of the two agencies, the GRU was, and still is, the bigger one. At one point, its officers were free to wear any Soviet rank and insignia they wanted, and as they lacked a designation, they were unable to be recognized as the GRU. This was an army of ghosts, always veiled in a great deal of secrecy. They were far smaller than the NKGB agents, but in Joseph Stalin's paranoid and egocentric environment, they were never able to win his unwavering allegiance and suffered greatly as a result. Because of Stalin's growing backing for Beria, the NKGB would emerge as the primary espionage organization throughout World War II. Beria's appointment to the head of the Soviet atomic bomb project in 1944 served as further evidence of this. American operations. Through the Soviet embassy and consular offices, as well as in private life, both agencies operated foreign residents in this intricate interaction. Stealing all of the scientific and technological advancements that the United States could offer was their unique mission. This included tank design, ciphers, and the forgery of millions of dollars worth of U.S. cash in the 1930s. The prize would be considerably bigger later. The agency's task also changed to comprehend American political and strategic thought after the U.S. entered World War II. The FBI and American military intelligence disregarded indications of this activity that were taking place in the United States at the time, as well as some agents' direct confessions. This failure came at a huge cost. Murdering Trotsky. The death of Leon Trotsky, Lenin's major ally in the 1917 Russian Revolution, was at the top of the NKGB's list of priorities prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Along with the suppression of external communist deviants. In 1929, Stalin was able to remove Trotsky from the succession struggle by having him banished. But, being Joseph Stalin, he could not tolerate a significant enemy living. He gave Beria and the NKGB instructions to prioritize assassinating Trotsky in his exile home in Mexico City. The man selected to spearhead the whole strategy would go down in spy history as General Pavel Sudoplatov, a prolific killer for the NKGB, and later the Atomic Spies spy master. He described his several death-dealing endeavors, including an assassination using a mined candy box, in his extremely contentious and frequently deceptive memoirs, Special Tasks, published in 1994. The memoirs offer an intriguing look into the Soviet hierarchy of the time, despite the caution required when reading them. Like nearly all Soviet special tasks, the operation was divided into many units and carried out in compartments. The renowned NKGB agent Yosef Grigulovich, a Lithuanian who was raised in Argentina, was in charge of one of these squads. This spy was so resourceful that he was appointed ambassador of Costa Rica to the Vatican on his subsequent assignment. Having a completely safe house to use for organizing Trotsky's murder and subsequent escape, however, was his challenge in 1940. He decided to make Santa Fe, New Mexico, his safe haven. In some way, Greenglass was able to connect with the Fuchs, a Lithuanian family that owned a pharmacy in the heart of Santa Fe's Plaza. His father had been a prominent pharmacy owner in Argentina. Greenglass's activities were probably unknown to the Fuchs, and their daughter Katie, who worked in the drugstore, might have welcomed him. Perhaps a relationship formed between Katie and the attractive, worldly agent who was a little older. In any case, the safe house in this strange place and this unlikely relationship were ideal for his schemes. It's obvious why the building was the ideal choice, and it still houses a Haagen-Dazs ice cream shop today. Access was possible through a heavily hidden rear entry, with little possibility of detection. Not that any American agency was looking back in 1940. On May 24, 1940, a gullible American bodyguard escorted Greenglass and his group of 20 agents, mostly communist veterans of the Spanish Civil War, into Trotsky's Mexico City compound. They attempted to bomb Trotsky's bedroom without success, using only pistols and one rapid-fire weapon. The Trotsky family survived. Santa Fe Safe House. Greenglass shot the American to prevent him from identifying the agents because he was furious over his team's failure. After that, he and the men parted ways, and Greenglass went back to Santa Fe to live quietly until returning to Argentina and eventually being assigned to the Vatican, where he would be given orders to assassinate Tito, the commander of the Yugoslav partisans, but these orders were never carried out. General Suda Platov said, "Stalin seemed patient and willing to play for higher stakes, putting his whole agent network on the line in a final effort to rid himself of Trotsky. On August 20th, 1940, Trotsky was assassinated by another team behind lone agent Ramon Mercador after Stalin was briefed about the initial failure to kill him." In his memoirs, Sudoplatov talked about what happened to the safe home in Santa Fe. The drugstore remained with the Fuchs until the 1990s. Therefore, his claim that Greenglass owned it and transferred it to another agent was incorrect. When he claimed that the house was used to spy on the Manhattan Project in neighboring Los Alamos, he may have been spreading false information. But there is probably some truth to his claim that some of the agents involved in the Trotsky plot also helped with the atomic bomb project's espionage. The Manhattan Project's initiators. The most well-known scientist and refugee from Nazi persecution, Albert Einstein, was persuaded by several scientists to write a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939, pointing out the possibility that extremely powerful bombs of a new type might be developed. The meeting that ensued after the letter was delivered between the president and his staff and renowned physicist Alexander Sachs led Roosevelt to begin the most covert and destructive project in human history. The United States was a little late to the game and actually got off to a very slow start, especially in comparison to Britain, as secret atomic projects were already underway in Britain, Germany, and Japan. Initially a committee to study the matter under former Massachusetts Institute of Technology Dean Vannevar Bush, this harmless beginning would eventually develop into the Manhattan Project. Things started to move more quickly after Italian physicist Enrico Fermi built the first atomic pile that supported a controlled chain reaction beneath the University of Chicago football stadium, stands in late 1942. By July 1942, a team of scientists led by Robert J. Oppenheimer, a bright, complicated, and determined physicist from the University of California at Berkeley, was attempting to determine whether a bomb was feasible. Brig General Leslie Groves of the Corps of Engineers, the Army's chief for atomic matters, took notice of him after he handled the numerous egos in the room. Despite Groves's tough military demeanor, this odd alliance would produce remarkable outcomes in just 3 years. Groves appointed Oppenheimer as the project's scientific leader in May 1942. The team would be made up of a small number of the top physicists in the world, including Fermi, Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, and Ernest Lawrence, and would eventually expand to include 12 Nobel Prize laureates. In addition to the necessary support staff of cooks, medical professionals, transportation, security, and so forth, tens of thousands of additional scientists, engineers, and technicians were enlisted for the project. Selecting sites for the Manhattan Project. 3 states would serve as the project's bases, although Hanford, Washington, would subsequently be selected for the production of plutonium. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was initially selected as the primary location for material production. However, the scientific and development site, which is the center of the project, was not yet selected. A crucial choice that would permanently alter New Mexico was taken at this early point in the project. Oppenheimer had a significant impact on the choice of location. Other southwestern states were assessed using particular standards centered on access, water availability, and security. Only locations in New Mexico remained after they were eradicated. In order to make the final decision, Groves and Oppie, as Oppenheimer was called, toured a number of isolated locations in November 1942. Oppenheimer had a deep affection for and knowledge of New Mexico. His family owned Perro Caliente, which translates to hot dog, a modest ranch along the breathtakingly gorgeous Pecos River Valley. He had trekked and cycled the region a lot, and he is most known for having named Lake Catherine after a buddy. Los Alamos Ranch School, a relatively affluent boys' school that alumni such novelist Gore Vidal, Sears president Arthur Wood, and American Motors president Roy Chapin attended, was one of the locations taken into consideration. Extremely rustic, the school would serve as the starting point for a physical plant that would grow many times again. Groves, however, admired the site's security potential, while Oppie adored the middle-of-nowhere setting. But was the decision made for other reasons? Groves probably didn't go into detail about his conflict with the evaluation committee over Oppenheimer's communist political beliefs when he offered him the chance to lead the project in May 1942. After first opposing hiring Oppenheimer, the committee finally conceded to Groves as there were no other suitable applicants. Did Soviet intelligence affect Oppenheimer? Oppenheimer's affiliation with communism and known communists was the problem that would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately bring an end to his career. Oppenheimer frequently hung out with well-known party members and made donations to the Communist Party in the late 1930s and early 1941, even before he was hired by the team in 1942. In addition, his brother Frank, sister-in-law Jacqueline, and his new wife Kitty all carried Communist Party cards throughout the early 1940s. Following the infamous Hitler-Stalin Pact, which saw the party's ranks eroded by this realpolitik attack on a few true humanists, they continued to be members. The vast majority of historians of the era acknowledge the Oppenheimers' affiliation with organized communists as fact. After this, the relationship between communism and the Oppie becomes extremely hazy and has never been described in detail. Oppie's communist friends were involved in a number of episodes during the war, though, which are believed to have come back to haunt him and ultimately bring him down in the middle of the 1950s. Although Oppie adored New Mexico and it fit the requirements for the site at the far-flung Los Alamos location, was there another factor at play when the decision was made in November 1942? Whether Oppie was hearing another source support the site 20 miles from the old NKGB Santa Fe location is the question. Was it GRU or NKGB spies who pushed for the location through one of his family party members? Unfortunately, unless a fresh source emerges, a secret government document comes to light, or an unquestionable Russian source comes to light. This will remain conjecture. The location's remoteness was meant to keep the scientists out of reach and separate the spy agents. But had this already been reversed? History documents that one of the most significant espionage coups in human history was about to take place in slumbering New Mexico, but we may never know. Those people who are atomic. The Manhattan Project was well advanced by the spring of 1943. The initial scientific staff were housed in more than 100 buildings, and thousands more were joining. The site's overall living and working circumstances were rudimentary to rustic. They would get better, but would still be difficult. When the project's public face was established at 109 East Palace next to the Plaza, Santa Fe became interested in it. All newcomers would check in here, and visitors to the town would be monitored. The Oppenheimers' first residence in the region, the La Fonda Hotel, served as a venue for meetings and other events. Both locations remain today. At General Groves' urging, the need for extremely strict security was one element of the project that received a lot of attention early on. His original plan was to enlist all scientists in the military because of the additional authority it would provide, but it was shelved. In addition to being extremely secret, the scientists were working on topics that were divided into distinct groups and were discouraged from exchanging information. Later on, as the value of collaboration became clear, this would be somewhat loosened. Fences, regular screenings, authorities reading and censoring letters, and phone tapping would all be used to maintain strict security. However, there were errors that appeared to show that things were out of control. Some personnel sneaked off to meet wives who were prohibited from being on post, despite being warned not to interact with locals. The lodge manager at the adjacent Bandelier National Monument, where the project provided accommodation and leisure, referred to them as those atomic people. Last but not least, the fence around the compound had a hole in it that was never fixed. Both project staff and the local Pueblo people utilized it to sneak onto the base to shop at the PX and gain access to the stunning New Mexico environment. Fuchs, Klaus. However, scarcely any of this mattered because a British GRU agent had been reporting on the Allied bomb project since its inception. When Klaus Fuchs, codename Charles, arguably the most significant of the atomic spies, arrived in New Mexico in 1944 with other British scientists, the secrets would begin to leak more quickly. Following Hitler's ascent to the position of chancellor in 1933, Fuchs, a German communist, left Germany. He studied physics in Britain. The Nazis' drive to kill his mother fueled his anti-Nazi fervor, which was further stoked by the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Fuchs was taken on at the British bomb project just prior to this invasion, and the GRU surreptitiously recruited him later that year. He gave his contacts useful information, which author E.B. Held said that Beria used it to convince Stalin that the Soviet Union needed to start an atomic endeavor. The breakthrough that Soviet intelligence services had been pursuing, but had thus far mostly failed to achieve, would come with Fuchs's arrival at Los Alamos. Fuchs and other Soviet operatives would communicate with the Moscow Center through the Soviet consulate in New York City, which served as the NKGB's American headquarters. The rest of the story was unknown until the late 1940s, even though the FBI had already located the site in New York. Fuchs provided his GRU contacts with important information about the work being done at Oak Ridge prior to his arrival at Los Alamos. This followed months of effort at Columbia University on the Manhattan Project in New York City. He started a string of espionage coups that are now legendary in Russia when he arrived at Los Alamos in the summer of 1944. Fuchs volunteered to be the project historian in addition to handling his area of expertise, theoretical physics. Ironically, he also went to the meetings where free speech was permitted, and Oppenheimer persuaded Groves that they were necessary. The core of the idea was the Soviet presence. Arno is the code name. Harry Gold, codename Arno, a Russian-born naturalized American and NKGB agent, was Fuchs's primary contact, first in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then in Santa Fe. Fuchs was probably not aware of this change in ownership, and he would go on to collect information for the next meeting, which was set for June 1945 in Santa Fe, because the NKGB had taken over the GRU network because of Kremlin politics and would be the lead agency for the campaign to infiltrate the Manhattan Project, codenamed Enormaz. In order to avoid suspicion, Harry Gold went to Santa Fe with his aging mother. E.B. Both men synchronized their watches with the Spitz Clock on the Plaza, according to Held. The clock is now located near the northwest corner of the plaza, rather than where it was originally located. They gathered at the bridge at the intersection of Paseo de Peralta and East Alameda Street at exactly 4 p.m. on June 2nd. The bridge was originally located a little to the east, but it has since been replaced. Following a few discussions, Fuchs gave Gold a package of material that would alter the course of history as he took him to the bus stop for the return trip to Albuquerque. The information in the packet would reach Moscow Center in around 10 days. Even now, the details are astounding. A comprehensive overview of the project was included in the packet, which included drawings of the bomb, technical discussions of the two distinct triggers to be used for Little Boy and Fat Man, nicknames for the bombs, which were uranium and plutonium bombs, respectively, information about the impending atomic test, and, finally, the United States' plan to use the bomb against Japan in the event that the tests were successful. Approximately 35 miles southwest of Socorro, New Mexico, at a remote desert test site codenamed Trinity, the world's first atomic device, the equivalent of 20 kilotons of TNT, was detonated above the sands on July 16, 1945. On August 6th, Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted a Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber named Enola Gay, overflew Hiroshima, Japan, dropping a uranium bomb that instantly destroyed the city and killed between 90,000 and 6,000 people. When the Japanese government refused to surrender right away, a second B-29, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney and named Box Carr, dropped another atomic bomb, the plutonium weapon that exploded over Nagasaki, killing between 60 and 80,000 people. On August 15th, the Japanese government agreed to unconditional surrender. The Second World War, which had killed around 50 million people, was finally over. In September 1945, Fuchs and Gold would cross paths again in Santa Fe, this time in the Masonic Rite Temple, located at the intersection of Paseo de Peralta and Bishop's Lodge Road. Fuchs informed Gold of the Trinity test results, as well as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki results as they were driving. It is reasonable to assume that the Soviets were as knowledgeable about the research as any fairly well-positioned scientist involved. The Soviet atomic bomb project would advance by years as a result of these incredible thefts. According to Jeffrey Richardson's A Century of Spies, Igor Kurchatov, the father of the Soviet bomb, told the Kremlin in his 1943 report that the material is of tremendous, inestimable importance for our state and our science. Fuchs and other British project participants typically supplied this information. However, a number of American Soviet operatives were about to come online with far more disastrous consequences, and their capture would lead to one of the worst scandals in American history. Ted Hall. Fuchs was unaware that there were other Americans working as NKGB operatives at Los Alamos. In 1944, a bright 18-year-old Harvard physics graduate with a left-wing outlook was added to the project. Ted Hall was his pseudonym, Moel Lad, which translates to young. He would set a contact in New York and offer to spy for the NKGB. He seems to have been inspired by the Soviet Union's seeming workers' paradise. But Moscow Center was closely monitoring him as a walk-in. Before he met an actual NKGB agent, it was decided that his best buddy, Saville Sachs, codenamed Star, would be his courier. During their encounter, which took place somewhere around Central and First Avenues in downtown Albuquerque, Hall provided Sachs with an amazing written document that included a list of scientists involved in the project as well as crucial information for the bomb's operation. The Moscow Center received this information via the New York office. In August 1945, Hall would meet with the NKGB on the University of New Mexico campus in Albuquerque and provide them with one final report on the Trinity test results through operative Lona Cohen, also known as Leslie. Even more advanced than the Fuchs material was Soviet understanding, thanks to Hall's amazing revelations. Liberal, Bumblebee, and Antenna. There were other NKGB operatives as well, especially those connected to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Codenamed Antenna and then Liberal, Julius Rosenberg left the Communist Party in 1943 to join the NKGB and quickly started proving his worth to the Moscow Center. He conducted several NKGB placements that were successful in expanding the project's penetration to complete the technical detail. One of these operatives, Rosenberg's brother-in-law, David Greenglass, also known as Bumblebee, was a young American serviceman assigned to Los Alamos. Greenglass was involved in the development of the plutonium bomb, and his contributions regarding the technical aspect as opposed to physics theory were crucial in bolstering the comprehensive reports that Fuchs and Hall sent to the Moscow Center. The Rosenbergs' relationship would turn out to be fatal. Gold and Greenglass had 2 meetings in his Albuquerque rooming house. Currently operating as the Spy House Bed and Breakfast, the address is 209 High Street. Greenglass's details on the device's implosion mechanism corroborated Fuchs and Hall's claims. For the Soviets, who were deeply worried about American disinformation or the personal motivations of operatives, this was crucial. Greenglass's validation of the Fuchs and Hall data gave Moscow Center confidence that they were getting useful, if not priceless, information. But despite Gold's natural apprehension about the dangers of spying, this crucial encounter between Gold and Greenglass started a chain of circumstances that ultimately led to Gold's death. Despite what author Held noted as, this was wartime New Mexico, which in 1945 probably had the highest per capita presence of counterintelligence officers of anywhere in the United States, these incredible espionage coups proved to be the pinnacle of the NKGB's penetration of the United States in the 1940s. Exposing American-Soviet espionage. As the light hit U.S. analysts about Soviet spying, the big red star in the West started to dim. As early as 1939, Soviet activities had started to come to light, but American authorities had not yet taken notice. The NKGB, the GRU, and the military command structure were the targets of purges in the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. The first GRU defectors appeared as the Soviet purges progressed. In 1937, Ignace Poretsky fled to Switzerland and was killed. For a first-hand description of the time period, his wife Elizabeth's book, Our Own People, is highly recommended. Even more shockingly, Poretsky's colleague and GRU defector, Walter Kravitsky, was found guilty of suicide in 1941 while in Washington, D.C., following his 1937 defect. A great introduction to life under Stalin and the Soviet intelligence service can also be found in his book, In Stalin's Secret Service. Many Soviet agents were quite uneasy about these incidents. Whittaker Chambers, an American citizen who came forward with his disclosures of Soviet surveillance in 1939, was the most uneasy and significant. Chambers was a GRU spy with contacts across the United States and Washington, D.C. Additionally, he oversaw Alger Hiss, one of the GRU's most significant agents. Defectors like Chambers played a key role in seriously harming Soviet surveillance in the United States. Golikov, the head of the GRU, traveled to America in the months after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, to discuss war objectives with Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration. But re-establishing the GRU network in the United States was a key component of his objective. The anti-fascist alliance with Moscow and the Roosevelt administration's Depression-era socialist sympathies made this easy to achieve. The investigations of the FBI. 1943 saw FBI Director J. An anonymous letter describing Soviet espionage in America was delivered to Edgar Hoover. According to Sudopletov's memoirs, Lieutenant Kolis Mironov, the NKGB resident in the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., sent the letter. This well-known letter, which was declassified in 1996, detailed operatives in every industrial town in the United States and claimed that they were stealing the whole of the war industry. It also included the first mention of the Soviet slaughter of Polish officers in the Katyn forest. According to many historians, the Cold War actually started with this bombshell. The FBI was taken aback by the letter, but at first there wasn't much follow-up. On the other hand, this probably helped the new U.S. In 1943, the Venona project was initiated to decrypt the secret Soviet radio traffic. Later, the Venona project would give the United States knowledge about the Soviets' wartime operatives and activities. See Spring 2011 issue of WWII Quarterly. Then, in 1945, Elizabeth Bentley, a member of the NKGB operating in the United States under the codename Good Girl, turned herself in and was given a debriefing by the FBI. After the CIA was shocked by her disclosures, understanding of the extensive Soviet infiltration slowly emerged. Remarkably, It was not until 1945 that another well-known GRU defection, that of Igor Guzhenko, the Soviet embassy GRU officer in Canada, would quickly reveal this enormous security vulnerability. The greatest gain is the one I feel deep down inside, that I did my duty towards the millions enslaved and voiceless in Russia today, Guzhenko said of his decision to defect. Significant elements of the Soviet atomic spy network were exposed as a result of his defection and conversations with Canadian, British, and American intelligence. This was due to the fact that Canadian atomic espionage was under the jurisdiction of the GRU. The degree of security upheld in the West against Soviet efforts and the relationship between the Soviets and the West would both be significantly impacted by Guzhenko's knowledge. He would, above all, validate the Venona transcripts and reveal the real names of the code names of American nationals employed by the Soviets. Furthermore, Whittaker Chambers would be sought out and interviewed by the FBI once more in 1945, this time with much more vigor. But his revelations would have to wait until 1948. One of the Soviet Union's most important agents, Alger Hiss. Whittaker Chambers' most significant agent in the 1930s was Alger Hiss, who had developed further in his government career throughout the war years. This was arguably the most important outcome of U.S. counterintelligence troops' disregard for Chambers' 1939 disclosures. Chambers' knowledge would remain unrecognized or of low priority until the Guzhenko and Elizabeth Bentley exposures. But throughout the war years, there were already worries about Hiss's potential ties to the Soviet Union. Remarkably, that did not stop him from traveling to Yalta with Roosevelt as a special member of the State Department delegation. His provision of plain language copies of American documents, which helped GRU decoding teams working on American codes throughout the war, was perhaps his greatest contribution outside of Yalta. Although he was not close to Roosevelt at Yalta, he was able to attend many talks about American policy and Stalin's demands because he was a note-taker. Hiss met daily with GRU General Milstein to brief the Soviets on the U.S. response to Soviet recommendations on the major issues of post-war Europe, Soviet involvement in the fight against Japan, and Poland's destiny. Together with the atomic data, this important information was given to Stalin every day and gave the Soviets a comprehensive view of the post-World War II world. Stalin understood that the Big Three needed to finalize his plan for Eastern Europe before the first use of the atomic bomb, which would drastically alter his negotiating position. The consequences of the disclosure of America's atomic secrets and post-war plans were truly strategic and decisive, not only encouraging the development and distribution of atomic weapons, but also setting the stage for another conflict after World War II. It is evident from this espionage that Stalin was far more aware of the American bombing attempts than President Harry S. Truman was at the time of the announcement at Potsdam. Disputes surrounding the Venona project. Hiss's arrest and conviction in the late 1940s and early 1950s did not mark the end of his story. It is still being told today. As a historical aside, Hiss was covertly awarded the Soviet Order of the Red Star for his contributions to the Soviet Union when he and other American officials were flying to Moscow for meetings following Yalta. Both Venona and Russian sources, as well as Soviet defectors, have verified the evidence against him. Venona decryptions of Soviet radio communications would eventually be linked to the disclosures made by the defectors. This was the best way for U.S. counterintelligence to verify the information that the defectors had provided. However, the information's use in court cases was restricted because it was highly classified and could not be made public. Confessions from any suspected agents are therefore required. Whether or not President Truman was aware of the attempt to undermine Soviet espionage in the U.S. is still up for debate. The research found pay dirt in 1949 after working on Soviet radio communications, from 1943 to 1945. Several decryptions exposed the Manhattan Project espionage. The identities and code names of the four main spies, three of whom had confessed, were determined by some shoddy Soviet message discipline. The American public would not see Venona until 1995. The Venona files are the source of all code names used in this article. The The most devastating disclosure happened in 1949 when Klaus Fuchs was revealed as a Soviet agent by British and FBI intelligence using Venona decrypts. Fuchs started talking as soon as he was questioned, and the tale of the atomic spies emerged. He blamed Harry Gold, one of his contacts, who blamed the Greenglasses, another of his contacts. The Greenglasses dubbed the Rosenbergs when they were challenged. These admissions were all exchanged for immunity from the death penalty. The Rosenbergs would be the only nuclear spies to pay with their lives, though, and they would never confess. Because the government was unable to provide the actual supporting evidence for these accusations, Venona Ted Hall was suspected and questioned, but managed to avoid punishment. The name of Oppenheimer was cleared. There are still many unanswered concerns regarding the Soviet infiltration of Enormos. Rumors and inquiries concerning uncaptured spies persist. The existence of an operative at Los Alamos, known by the codename Perseus, was the subject of a persistent but unsubstantiated rumor. If true, who was he and how detrimental was his contribution to the NKGB's historic victory? However, codename Chester is by far the most contentious subject. After extensive research utilizing Venona, decrypts, and other sources, it was determined that Chester was Robert Oppenheimer. General Sudopladov's memoirs, which suggested that Oppenheimer was a Soviet agent, sparked even more debate in 1992. Other writers, most notably Romerstein and Brindell in the Venona Secrets, agreed. Oppenheimer was, without a doubt, his own worst adversary. He was a target simply because of his attitude towards security and power. His stance against the hydrogen bomb appeared to cast doubt on his intention to maintain American dominance in nuclear weapons. His affiliation with well-known communists and the fact that members of his own family were Communist Party members were clear indicators of his political inclinations. His awkward concealment of some wartime episodes would come to light and seriously harm him at his appearance before the Atomic Energy Commission to renew his security clearance. His dismal performance at the hearing virtually assured him of failure. After losing that battle, he would spend nearly 10 years as the government's persona non grata. But in 1962, President John F. Kennedy would urge his counterintelligence chief at CIA to investigate the matter further. Surprisingly, the officer used Venona decrypts to determine that the NKGB had made numerous attempts to flip Oppenheimer, but the decrypts did not provide any proof that this had ever occurred. According to the CIA investigators' conclusion, an E.B. Kennedy was able to provide Oppenheimer support and make plans to present him with the Enrico Fermi Medal for distinguished scientific contributions to the United States because, as held states in A Spy's Guide to Santa Fe and Albuquerque, there was room for an honest difference of opinion. Sadly, Kennedy would be killed before he could deliver the medal. President Lyndon B. Johnson did so in the White House in 1963. As of right now, scholars agree that Oppenheimer was not a Soviet spy. The Manhattan Project's legacy. The Cold War between the U.S. and the USSR lasted for more than 40 years, during which time both countries and their surrogates engaged in combat and espionage. For all those years, nuclear catastrophe would loom large over the world, and during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, it nearly came to pass. Nonetheless, one could argue that the threat posed by these weapons prevented larger conflicts. Following the use of the bombs, the Pacific War ended nearly immediately, which was the first event influenced by the Manhattan Project. Although the atomic bombings claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Japanese, a swift conclusion to hostilities protected millions of Japanese military personnel and civilians, as well as Chinese civilians and American military personnel. The estimated number of American and Japanese casualties in the planned invasion of Japan is significantly higher than the number of bomb casualties. Add to this the expected increase in Japanese famine deaths brought on by the Titan U.S. Navy submarine, Corden, as the conflict would have gone on, and the figures greatly above projections of bomb casualties. What if Japan had been invaded by the Soviet Union? What if one accounts for ongoing Chinese casualties as the conflict progressed? Ironically, the 500,000 Purple Hearts that were created in honor of the American invasion, victims were never given out but are still being distributed. From an American perspective, 65 years later, the bomb decision was obviously justifiable. Furthermore, the Soviet Union did not invade Europe in the ensuing years. In Korea, the line was held. The Soviet Union never took control of Berlin. In the peaceful state of New Mexico, the Manhattan Project left behind a legacy of scientific progress. The state was no longer a place that was a little behind. Rather, it developed into a significant scientific hub for the country. The world believes that the new blazing light that has been introduced to that high desert will never be seen again. Yet the chilies are still green, and the sunsets are breathtakingly gorgeous.